My name is Niklas Svanström, and I'm heading the Institute of Security and Development Policy here in Stockholm. Today, we're going to talk about Taiwan in limbo, challenges and prospects for participation in the United Nations system. And before I introduce the speakers, I'm going to let Dr. Clement Gu, the representative of Taipei Mission here in Sweden, to say a few words. So I'll leave it to you, and then I'll take it from there.
Yes, thank you, Nicholas. It's my great honor and pleasure. Again, come to ISDP. I said always, ISDP, Institute for Security and Development Policy. Actually, ISDP can say also, I secure democracy and peace. So in this regard, Taiwan play a very crucial role nowadays in East Asia. Of course, it is also a very important point in the global village. Now, today we talk about international participation for Taiwan. One very important point is that 2758 resolution in the year of 1971. So many of our friends understand this resolution actually just present a so-called issues. The China seats in the UN since 1971 belong to the People's Republic of China. However, this resolution doesn't mention at all Taiwan or even mention at all so-called Taiwan sovereignty belong to the so-called PRC. However, PRC China, they distorted this resolution and combined with their one China principle. So therefore, they claim Taiwan is a part of the PRC, and therefore they can use the so-called military drill around Taiwan on the one hand, that is a military provocation. On the other hand, they can use this way, so-called Taiwan has no right to international organization. However, you know, this resolution already got so many countries in the world. They have their own idea. What is this 2758 resolution? Just give you example. Sweden, Minister of Foreign Affairs, she mentioned 2758 resolution doesn't address, just only address the issue, the China seats, but doesn't address the issue, whether Taiwan's representative can represent in the international organization in other way. And Swedish government support Taiwan's meaningful participation in the international organization. So that is the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Transportation or Infrastructure. He mentioned also Swedish government support Taiwan's meaningful participation in the international organization. And furthermore, 6 countries in the world already, their parliament adopt the resolution, support Taiwan's meaningful participation in the UN framework. Of course, we can see that nowadays there are so many challenges, not just only because Taiwan or because the so-called Taiwan, we are located on the front of expansion of authoritarian. Nowadays we are facing different kind of issue like cognitive warfare, like cyber attack, like we call gray zone tactic. So and we should do one thing. I said one thing is we have on one hand we have common value, we have common interesting. Now we have common threat, and common threat. How could we use what kind of way to deal with such kind of common threat? My short point is that if we can, we should use one way we call common action. So that means common value, common interesting, and now we should use a way common action. I give you example. Swedish government support Taiwan very strong in regarding to the so-called international participation. And we do hope many countries like Sweden, not just only in your capital, speak out something, say something, but also in the international forum, or we call assembly, like WHO, like ICAO, the end of this month will be held, or in the UN assembly, can speak out what's your idea regarding the so-called like-minded country, a democratic country like Taiwan. How could we hand in hand support each other and share more common values? Taiwan. I said Taiwan means T-A-I-W-A-N. And that means T, of course, top. AI is AI. W is wonderful. A means attractive. And of course, nation. So top AI, wonderful, attractive nation. A so good partner for the world. Of course, we should do more cooperation each other. In this regard, I must underline again, democracy, freedom, and the human rights. If we said democracy, yes, look, Taiwan, we have so good tea. We have very good black tea, green tea, oolong tea, high mountain tea, bubble tea, even our guarantee and hospitality. However, the best tea in Taiwan is our democratic tea. In this regard, I hope we do believe our like-minded country, we can stick together and hand in hand do our so-called common action. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. This is always interesting. I mean, the meaningful participation is important. And I think it also is important with peaceful resolution of this. And that is sort of, we find something that is, useful and creating stability. So engagement is important, and a commitment from the European Union is absolutely essential to ensure that violence is never an option. This is, I think, incredibly important, both from the European side and the Swedish side. But as you say, maybe people can speak up more. But just to all the viewers, if you can ask questions, please use the Q&A. I will see your questions on my phone, and I will read them out for everyone. But before I open with any questions, maybe we should start with a few presentations.
Nicholas,
just
1 point.
1 point, absolutely.
I just want to share with our participants and our two presenters. Today we have a special guest from Taiwan direct, is our member of parliament in education committee, Ms. Lin. She is also here.
Should I wave the hand to everybody?
Hello.
Okay, hello everyone.
Hello.
It's nice to be here. Thank you.
So first we're gonna have, and Antonia, I always apologize for butchering your name. My Polish is not as good as it should be. Dr. Antonia Luszkiewicz Mendes. She's an assistant professor at Jagiellonian University, visiting scholar at the moment at University of Oxford. And then we have Dr. Susha Anna Frenzy, who is now an associated fellow at ICP. She's also at the Department of Political Science, Free University of Brussels. And she also ran the 9-line. If you haven't looked at that, I would recommend you to log into that. But each one will have 20 minutes. If you can make it a bit quicker, I would be grateful, but maximum 20 minutes for your presentations. So Antonia, I will let you start.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful webinar. And thank you for such a great introduction, both of ourselves. And as you can see, Middle and Eastern European difficult names are our trademark. So this is how it is. But I guess we are both fine with that. And actually, we just found out that we are both right now in Romania. So greetings from this beautiful Eastern European country. a country which also has a little bit, well, I would say difficult prospects of developing relations with Taiwan, because traditionally speaking, Romania has had very good relations with China. We don't have time to go into details, but when we talk about the Western or EU support for Taiwan, we have to remember that each and every country has its own individual path, history, and legacy of relations with both China and Taiwan, depending on the case study. So it's very hard to speak as one block, right? So sometimes we just have to go into those individual cases and see the dynamics of local politics. But let me first share my screen with you, and I'll try to present a broader picture, let's say, of why Taiwan is in a limbo, because this is pretty much the main theme of our meeting today. So I hope you can see my slide, and I wanted to start with a very brief introduction about the General Assembly resolution that was already mentioned by Mr. Ambassador. So yes, indeed, it was a resolution which, some say, clarified the representation of China to the United Nations, meaning that the so-called China seat was passed on to the representatives of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, from the ROC, Republic of China, Taiwan. However, it's also very, very important to stress that this resolution did not really define the status of Taiwan. The only thing it did was passing this China seat to the representatives of the PRC and removing the ROC representation from all UN agencies. However, it does not define what Taiwan is, whether it's an independent country or whether it's a part of PRC. Nothing like that is mentioned. So it's important to stress that and clarify that, because when it comes to China's narratives, we very often hear that the resolution once and for all clarified that Taiwan is a part of China. No, the resolution does not mention anything like that. Nonetheless, Beijing has been using this resolution in its, I would say, misleading narratives to say that, yes, Taiwan has always been a part of China, and it actually highlights the One China principle. And here again, I would like to just briefly discuss the difference between One China policy and One China principle, because to be very honest with you, I've talked a lot with various diplomats, including diplomats from my home country, Poland, and I'm astonished to say that the knowledge, the understanding of those differences is quite limited. So it's important to clarify those differences, because these two words are similar at the first glance. However, they mean something very, very different. So basically, One China policy is other countries' policy idea about the One China concept or framework. And very often these definitions are quite ambiguous, meaning that many countries in the world recognize that, yes, there is one China in the world. However, they do not say that Taiwan is a part of China, or they do not say that Taiwan is a part of PRC. So many of them have this kind of ambiguous attitude. And the best example is the US definition, which only acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. So basically acknowledges, meaning we hear you, right? It's not recognizing, it's acknowledging that this is a position in Taiwan and in China on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. However, we do not clarify that we Americans think that Taiwan is a part of China or part of PRC in the more extreme version. Whereas the PRC's official position, meaning the One China principle, is very straightforward, saying that, of course, the Taiwan is a part of China, and the PRC is the only legitimate representative, legitimate government of the whole of China. The Beijing has been using One China principle to claim that you have to follow One China principle in order to have diplomatic relations with Beijing, which is again not true. Because as the research shows, most of the countries of the world have One China policy. So the more ambiguous version, whereas only about 50 countries actually adopted the One China principle, so the very definition that is proposed by Beijing. So you can say that this is pretty much a minority. And since we are both today, both meaning myself and Zhuzha, we are speaking from the European position, just a quick reminder that the EU policy towards Taiwan has evolved. And I'm pretty sure my colleague will get more into details. I just wanted to briefly, paint this framework that in the past, EU was quite hesitant to develop political relations with Taiwan, whereas in recent years, this support has been much more vocal, including the last year resolution in which EU said openly that only Taiwan's democratically elected government can represent the Taiwanese people on the international stage. So here we are getting to the very core of our discussion in this webinar. So Taiwan's participation or meaningful participation in international organizations. So EU clearly states that only Taiwanese democratically elected authorities have the right to represent people living in Taiwan. Interestingly, in the United States, we also have pretty powerful legislation that hardly anybody knows about or remembers about. The thing is that the most important and most interesting one of them is the Taipei Act of 2019, because it has truly global implications. What I mean is that in this legislation, technically, the United States can either reward or punish other countries basing on depending on what kind of relations with Taiwan they have. So if you have good relations with Taiwan, good economic relations, when you support Taiwan's meaningful participation in IOs, then you should be rewarded. But if you are doing things against Taiwan, you can be punished by the United States. Of course, it's a legislation. So the whole question is to what extent in the future the White House will be willing to use this act, right? So whether it will really feel like implementing this act in reality. Right now, we are really in limbo, and maybe not even a limbo. The situation is very dynamic when it comes to US-China relations and US-European relations as well. So it's really hard at the moment to tell where these things are going. So there are a lot of challenges related to this whole international situation. Surely, speaking on myself, I would say that one of the biggest threats for Taiwan right now is the declining role of the United States in international organizations. And for example, Washington is going to leave UNESCO again by the end of next year. Again, because I believe it would be the third time when US is leaving UNESCO, where 3 times is a charm, they say. So we will see how it goes. But this is truly, disturbing, especially for Taiwan and the prospects for Taiwan for returning to the family of the UN agencies. As I said at the very beginning, we also have to look at the domestic situation of each and every country. EU does speak as one bloc, but of course the implementation of certain rules, legislations very much depends on the local situation. And this is dynamic too, because we are democratic countries, so we have very often change of power every 4 or 5 years. So it really depends on those local authorities to what extent we want to develop relations with Taiwan or not. And I believe we can talk about Romania, Poland, and other countries later in the Q&A session. And right now we are going through big turbulences in transatlantic relations, as I've already mentioned as well. So I believe there is a big temptation in Europe to move closer to China, to look for alternatives when it comes to transatlantic relations. India is another alternative right now. Europe really wants to sign the FDA agreement with India, and negotiations are going on, but China might actually become even more important or powerful partner for Europe, which of course would not be that much beneficial for Taiwan. But let us not be totally pessimistic. I also want to talk about some opportunities. So we talk about the one China policy / principle, but it's not a destiny. It's not given that it has to be either PRC or ROC in United Nations, for example, because we do have countries which do not recognize one another, like North and South Korea, and yet they are both present in the United Nations. So it's not any sort of destiny, it's not given. It's just evolution of a particular situation or particular case. Taiwan used to be invited in the past as an observer to various meetings and assemblies. So again, it all depends on the particular situation at the moment. There are also IOs where you can have one member, one vote. So if you have a majority of countries supporting you, you can actually join, and you don't even have to be a member of the UN per se. You can simply join particular UN agencies, like UNESCO, for example. Then, as I've already mentioned, we also saw a big evolution of attitude in various countries and organizations. And I believe in the last 5 years, a big game changer was the pandemic. So that was really the 5 minutes that Taiwan used very, very well to promote itself, to show that it's a very reliable democratic partner. It has a very successful health diplomacy. And this is when the eyes of the world were really focused on Taiwan as a true success story. So this opportunity was not missed by Taiwan. And wrapping up this presentation, in the end, I wanted to stress that it's not just about Taiwan being out of international organizations, being out of United Nations, for example. It's also highly concerning, and it's very disadvantageous to other countries that Taiwan is not present in those IOs, particularly the like-minded democratic countries. For example, if Taiwan is not present in WHO, it cannot share its experience. And that was particularly painful during the COVID-19 pandemic, because Taiwan had experience with SARS in the past and also dealt with it quite successfully. But because of the absence of Taiwan in WHO, it couldn't share its experience, its success stories, its know-how on various international platforms. Also, from a more political or ideological point of view, democratic countries need Taiwan on those shared platforms because it strengthens the democratic voice. So it's not just Taiwan needing the world, it's the world needing Taiwan. And it always comes in a pair. So if Taiwan is not there, we are actually leaving more space for the PRC to promote its narratives, its standpoint, its interpretation of various laws and rules, and to impose its own worldviews and the world order and change this world order from within. And if the United States is also not there or doesn't treat IOs as a priority, we are in trouble. We, meaning democratic, like-minded countries, are in trouble because we are being weakened. So, as I said, we need Taiwan as well. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to Q&A session.
Thank you very much. And I have to say you kept your time really well and saved time for the Q&A, which I'm extremely grateful for. And now we have Susha, our second speaker, and let's hear you.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation and also the opportunity to interact with all of you around the same table, virtual table. It's always a pleasure, and it's always good to have such conversations on a regular basis. And I think that's something that will come back to my conversation about what the EU does concerning Taiwan, the regularity and consistency. So this is a very high value that ISDP brings to the international debate. So I just wanted to point that out. And I also want to greet Ambassador Gu here in the room, and also a member of the parliament from Taiwan. It's good to see you. And so because Nicholas, you made it clear that we should be very careful with time, I think I'll just go straight to my slides, and let me just share those with you. And so what I would like to do is, because Antonina, you set the stage so well for us here, I don't need to dwell on specifics in terms of the resolution. So what I would like to do is to focus on Taiwan's internationalization and the EU, and what the EU's role has been or can be, and what are the dynamics that underline the EU's approach vis-a-vis Taiwan in this regard. So this is based, so my experience is based on the years I've been spending in Taiwan since 2020. And Antonina, you mentioned the pandemic, so that was exactly the period that I was full-time and safe in Taiwan, I should say, and also my years spent in the European Parliament between 2008 and 20, when I worked as a parliamentary advisor. So that's where my EU background comes, and that's hopefully something that will help the conversation. So here's my main argument, and I would like to kind of build this out in the next 15 minutes or so. And this is, it goes as follows. So in my view, there's a Taiwan narrative in Brussels at this stage, which has emerged in the EU within the boundaries of the One China policy that the EU has, and also in the boundaries of, or in the context rather, of the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy since 2021. So it's a safe place, I should say, the Indo-Pacific strategy, but I'll get into that later. And I would also say that this is not too little and not too late, this Taiwan narrative, the emergence of it, but perhaps it is not yet enough to push back and counter Beijing's interference. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that Beijing, in fact, is interfering in the EU's sovereign policymaking space concerning Taiwan, when it claims that the EU is in fact interfering in Beijing's internal affairs. As we know, for Beijing, for the PRC, Taiwan is its internal affair. Therefore, any third country dealing with Taiwan is interference in Beijing's view. So I'm flipping the narrative here, and I argue that it is in fact Beijing that is interfering in our relations with Taiwan. And this is because Beijing is often very effectively exploiting the lack of understanding, the lack of consistency in the EU, and also the lack of strategic coordination. Antonina already pointed out, and I always do it at the beginning as you did, that the EU is a bloc, but the EU is 27 sovereign member states. So we always have to be very mindful that the dynamics are very diverse, but this is a given. This is the EU that we have, and this is the EU that we have to work with. So that's for my main argument. I will lay out a little, like the big picture on EU-Taiwan relations, where we are. I will speak about China, what China wants in my view, and what China is doing in general, and also concerning Taiwan, and what then the EU and member states do or should do together with Taiwan. And I think this is very important here in my view, because we often leave Taiwan out of the conversation as if Taiwan was an object that we have to do things for. But in fact, I think that's also part of this Taiwan narrative, that we are dealing with each other as partners. So this is a partnership with Taiwan that we have to reinforce going forward. So where are we in EU-Taiwan relations? As I said, we have a Taiwan narrative, which in my understanding reflects the fact that in the EU, so at the institutional level, when I say the EU, I mean really the Brussels bubble, the institutions, which is also very diverse, because different institutions have different roles and different weight. But let's just keep it for the sake of this conversation as the institutional level. There is more awareness about and of Taiwan's importance. There's also more clarity in the language that we use about Taiwan, and there's more pushback against Beijing's attempt to curtail our space and to tell us how we can or we cannot go forward with Taiwan. So this is a positive development. Therefore, it means that we no longer talk about Taiwan in the EU only through a China lens, but we have a conversation about Taiwan on its own merit. And I mentioned that this is also very clearly and very, I would say, safely anchored in the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. And this is rooted in the idea that the EU has its own interest to protect. And so I'm using the quote here from the Indo-Pacific strategy that says that the display of force and increasing tensions in regional hotspots, including the Taiwan Strait, may have a direct impact on European security and prosperity. So I think this clarity is there. It was also, in a way, amplified by what happened with the pandemic and how that changed Taiwan's international profile in a positive sense. And also, since China's support to Russia in the invasion of Ukraine and in the ongoing aggression against Ukraine, I think as a result of that, the EU sees China as an enabler of Russian aggression. which is also indirectly shaping the European security architecture. So there is an increased sense of urgency to strengthen resilience with like-minded partners, and Taiwan is clearly mentioned as one. And this is where parliamentary diplomacy comes in. The European Parliament has been, I would say, one of the core or the main, but perhaps the not most decisive EU institution. I also would like to mention the resolution from 2021 in which the EP urges the EU to intensify political relations with Taiwan. And again, the clarity I mentioned is that this is going to happen under the guidance of the EU's One China policy. So nothing's changed there, but this clarity is important vis-a-vis Beijing, that we have the right to do this sort of engagement with Taiwan within this context, and also to consider Taiwan a key partner, democratic ally in the Indo-Pacific. Not only resolutions, but also parliamentary delegations have been important throughout the past years, from the Foreign Affairs Committee or the committee that looks at disinformation, as well as this year, the Democracy Shield Committee of delegation that visited Taiwan in July. And this helps normalize exchanges. And in that, so this EUDS, the Democracy Shield visit that happened in July, and President Lai met the delegation and he greeted, obviously they had consultations in which I'm using a quote from the president in which he said that we hope to share our experiences with Europe. And this is something I'll come back to in terms of this being a partnership where we can learn from each other, not just a one-sided road. And then we have an important resolution from October 2024, which is called, which deals with the misinterpretation of UN Resolution 2758 by the PRC and its continuous military provocations around Taiwan. So speaking of narrative and why this is important, because it creates more consistency and space in the European narrative space. This, I would say, is without precedent, and it is adding on to those countries that Ambassador Gu mentioned before, that there is an increasing number of countries that take a stronger stance on this. And I think the fact that we have this resolution that says, it refers to the 2758 resolution, but it also says on the right side here that whereas the EU continues to maintain its own One China policy, which is different from the PRC's One China principle. Because as Antonina already explained, it's so easy to go back and forth and confuse people and take advantage of their lack of understanding. We need to make it clear, and this is the clarity in our Taiwan narrative, that the policy is not the PRC's principle. So I need to speed up here because Antonina was so good with time. I cannot be worse than that. So let me just continue. Let me say a few words about the EU-China context, because obviously, I mean, we all follow this conversation, and it's a difficult one, you know, perhaps as low as it gets when it comes to the bilateral relationship. In the Europeans' understanding, China is increasingly assertive, ambitious, anti-Western, pushing forward its anti-Western agenda and shaping narrative on global governance. We have the Belt and Road Initiative. We have a series of initiatives. As I list them here, the most recent is the Global Governance Initiative, which in fact was put forward in September, or well, this month, in Tianjin at the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And I think this language, well, I think it's interesting to see how Beijing is really skillfully managing to appeal to the developing countries to say that, you know, we will stay within the UN system. We're not trying to overturn, as if you see the first quote here, to overturn the existing international order or to create another framework. Rather, the goal is to make the existing international system better at taking actions, working effectively, and so forth. So I think this is part of this ambition for global leadership based on such capacity to shape global narrative. So shape economic rules, technology standards, political institutions, shape discourse, and establish a viable alternative to Western style governance. And part of this is, well, this goes along with the message that Xi Jinping, as the leader of China, is firmly in power, in control, despite the economic slowdown. So what is effectively happening on the ground is that, yes, power projection, influence projection within the Indo-Pacific and beyond in the developing world, and the One China principle is often included in all these bilateral agreements that China has with countries in Africa or countries in Southeast Asia and across the world. So there is a very serious challenge, I think, for us, the rest of us in the democratic world, to be able to counter those efforts. I have more here on China's internal dynamics, but I think I'll skip that so we have more time for discussion. And so Ambassador Gu also mentioned cognitive warfare and this approach to use disinformation and to manipulate information about cross-strait relations, about one China, and also to rally global support for the legitimacy claims that the PRC has over Taiwan. So this is all part of the narrative shaping. And so this brings me to my last slide here, where if we start from the assumption that Taiwan's defense is important for the global order, then it is a logical conclusion that we can draw that it is in Europe's interest to get more strategic and consistent on Taiwan and to go push forward for Taiwan's meaningful participation in international organizations. So this requires enhancing public awareness of the complexity of cross-strait relations. Antonina, you mentioned, and I share your disappointment at even the most relevant and informed political leadership in Europe often gets it wrong when it comes to policy versus principle. And I would also argue that we are very often very reactive to what China does, also concerning Taiwan. So we have to be proactive and not just push back against those efforts to undermine our sovereign right to collaborate with Taiwan, but to be proactive and strategic about it. And flipping that narrative, I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Also, Antonina, if you think that's something that you would support, because I think it's very clear that China has been very successfully managing to say that everyone's interfering in its own internal affairs, but we need to flip that and say, well, actually, that's the other way around. So strategic communication is important. And so I am just sharing here my recent book to wrap up, just to say that everything that I kind of laid out here in I don't know how many minutes is you can find more detail about that, and I'm happy to engage with anyone in the audience in more detail on that and anything that you might want to ask me questions about. So thanks for your attention, and I look forward to the public conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And well, both kept the time extremely well. But I thought it was extremely enlightening. I mean, it's very clear that we have two of the absolutely best Taiwan scholars in Europe, and I would say globally as well. Very clear on the topics, clear clarification. I think it's important to make that distinction between policy and principle, and we all tend to be sloppy with the concept, and I think but words do matter, and I think this is very important. I'm also extremely happy that we've highlighted that it's not, well, China's always saying that we are committing errors, we are pushing into their sphere of interest, etc. But actually limiting Europe's foreign policy is also an interference in internal affairs. So I think we can turn around that question, which was well presented here. So very good clarifications on many of these issues. I mean, what I come down to, and I hope you can come up with some sort of actionable recommendation. And actually, one of the questions that comes up from Frederica Bagna is beyond statements of support, what practical steps can Taiwan's allies take to push for its meaningful participation in international organizations? And this is a question I also sort of encounter. I mean, we know that China is going to block most of it, and China and its allies, be that Russia, be that North Korea, etc. All these 55 people that adheres to China's interpretation of the situation. But what can we do? And especially, I mean, from my point of view, trade comes in as one of these absolutely fundamental actors. And Clement, you usually tell us how important Taiwan is as an economic actor, and it is fundamentally important. And the blockade of Taiwan will impact Europe extremely negative, and the world economy at large. But what are the practical steps that you would recommend us to take to ensure Taiwan's meaningful participation? Anyone who wants to start?
Susan, would you like to start, because I had my presentation first? So what about you go first now?
Oh, thank you. I was going to suggest that since I finished, you can go first, but let's just use the time wisely. Well, Nicholas, that's I think the question that we're all struggling with, in the sense of finding the concrete ways that we can contribute, because I think what we're seeing is an increase in the assertiveness from Beijing, and also the leverage that Beijing uses over European countries in this regard through trade. And so the de-risking was thought out as a policy that would decrease our exposure to China. But then again, I think the whole de-risking agenda, as much as I think is the right way forward, but I think it turns out to be a very difficult and long-term agenda for obvious reasons, because critical dependencies you cannot make up for at any short time. So I would say that we need to continue, and we also need to have a good and honest conversation to see what works. If we have an understanding of what works in terms of putting pressure, and not just putting pressure on China, but also sending a message to China that democratic countries that are like-minded are willing to build cooperation, I think that's one way to send the message that this is our intention, and that we will be serious about it. Again, whether we're taken seriously by China is also often undermined by our own actions because of our back and forth when it comes to China. But I think it's all related to how our relationship with China will evolve, will affect also our space and our political will with Taiwan. So concrete cooperation, there's many different areas that I think we have started to deepen in terms of concrete bilateral cooperation, also in terms of resilience building. We talked about narrative and disinformation. There is very clear progress we're making in engaging civil society at an EU level, but also member state level. But again, perhaps I would highlight what I said earlier, that nothing will make sense if we're not consistent about it. So the Europeans need to learn to be consistent when we talk to China. I don't think is realistic to expect the EU to speak with one voice. We will never speak with one voice. We're not a country, but we have to manage our internal differences. And I think we've shown in the past 5 years that when it comes to being serious about it, I think we get united, but the consistency matters. So that's perhaps where I stop here. Perhaps, Antonina, you have something more concrete to add.
No, I absolutely agree with you that we also have to do with disinformation and misinformation. And of course, legal things, resolutions are extremely important, and they, introduce some clarification, but everything starts on the ground. And here in Romania, in recent days, I had the chance to talk with a lot of policymakers, diplomats, and people involved in, public life affairs. And they are mostly worried about Russian disinformation, misinformation campaigns. So, and again, this is a kind of Middle and Eastern European bubble, I would say. We are looking, I don't know, Zuzia, if it's you have the same reading, but at least in our Polish or Romanian bubble, we focus on the Russian influence, Russian disinformation, misinformation, which is, of course, very, very serious. And you probably know that 2 days ago, Poland shot down drones, Russian drones, which entered our airspace, which was unprecedented because it's not just a Polish airspace, also NATO and EU airspace, right? So we have to understand the seriousness of the situation. And I keep, telling my colleagues in Poland or here in Romania that, yes, Russia is there. It's our, direct threat, but China is right behind it. All right, so China will be there, and China is already here. Let's think about the comprehensive partnership between China and Belarus. They had joint military exercises with Chinese soldiers few kilometers away from the Polish and EU border. So China is already here in Europe. China will like to have a big share of the cake after the war. Hopefully the war will end at some point in Ukraine. And China will really like to participate in the so-called rebuilding of Ukraine. But on what terms? Will it be the same case like in Georgia when they have access to the Black Sea through the Naklya port right now, which is a very controversial matter? Will it be the same thing as Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, which now has to be leased for 99 years to the Chinese? And who knows, one day might be turned into a military base. We don't know. And we have to be very, very careful about to what extent we let China into our doorstep, into our European doorstep. And disinformation, misinformation come with it. They are part of the package, right? And this also refers directly to the Taiwan issue. So right now, maybe across, like, for example, Polish media, we don't really hear that many comments about Taiwan being a part of China and so on and so forth. But I'm pretty sure it will come at some point. Right now, we focus on the Russian case, but if Taiwan is more discussed, if China takes more aggressive steps towards Taiwan, I'm pretty sure we will have a lot of Russian trolls on Facebook and other social media platforms saying, yeah, Taiwan has always been a part of China. Taiwan is just an island which should go back to China, and things like that. So we have to prepare for it right now. And it's both about the top-down initiatives of our governments and also international platforms like EU, and bottom-up. So we have to support all kinds of NGOs which deal with the kind of disinformation, misinformation, because we simply don't have time.
I got to follow up actually on what Antonia said. We actually came out with a book a couple of months ago on Sino-Russian cooperation and disinformation. It was an edited volume. I was the editor for it together with a colleague. And I would actually say that already the collaboration we see is immense, be that in Ukraine or be that in Asia. And then we're coming out, hopefully today, are coming out with a book on Sino-Russian cooperation in the Arctic. And that's the same thing. So I would actually say China is already in our backyard with the assistance of Russia. And that complicates it a lot. So I think that point is extremely valid. So let me, I'm gonna be, well, one issue that comes up from a few here, how could Taiwan, this is from Luke Sandvall, how can Taiwan strategically leverage Europe's current hesitation towards China to advance its international participation? But I think we can also turn the question around a bit, because of course, how can China manipulate the current geopolitical situation to limit Taiwan's international space? Because let's be honest here, in the geopolitical environment today, if you compare Xi Jinping and President Trump, Xi Jinping's looks like he stands for predictability, sustainability compared to President Trump. And you talk to the business community. There was an article here in the daily industry, Dagens Industri, a couple of months ago, where they talked about giving China a second chance. So the business community is already turning around here. So how does, how can Taiwan use the European reluctance to be too dependent on China? And how could China, in its turn, use the geopolitical situation? I think Europe needs to be prepared for this. I mean, we need to be able to identify opportunities and challenges. And it's up to you to decide what is an opportunity and a challenge, of course. But Susha, you turned off I'll let you start.
Yes, thank you. I think that, that's exactly the biggest, in a way, challenge, because we see transatlantic relations going through difficult times. And we also see Trump putting pressure on Taiwan in terms of defense. And conversations in Taiwan are clearly a lot more revolving around what does this mean for us. We also know that we are working with a Taiwan that is internally polarized, and that's not good for Taiwan, but it is good to strengthen its democracy, perhaps in the long run. But what's important is to work with with those divisions in society, political divisions, and the one actor that can benefit most from that sort of polarization is obviously the PRC. So if we connect all these dots, then we see that every single country is exposed to this uncertainty in different ways, but we see clearly that the EU and Taiwan are both, they already both express this awareness that the common challenge, as Ambassador Gu said, and perhaps to play with your thought there, is that we need to find that common action. And I think we are already working on that. We are in a learning process, the EU and Taiwan, and I think the deeper engagement that we've seen in terms of trade and investment on both sides, and stronger exchanges or more frequent exchanges, I think will take us in that direction. However, the challenge is to to understand in Taiwan, I think perhaps if I can speak when it comes to the Taiwanese side, what is the challenge to strengthen ties with Europe? I think the challenge might be there is to understand the complexity of Europe and to identify those actors at different levels that are most open and willing to work with Taiwan, and understand what are the areas that offer most opportunities. We mentioned we didn't mention semiconductors, but I was going to mention semiconductors and tech. We mentioned resilience and disinformation. But I think there are specific areas that these conversations are already happening. So we need to also give credit to and recognize that we are on that path, but we need to keep this sense of urgency, and we cannot believe that an unreliable United States makes China more reliable. None of our problems with China have disappeared because we're struggling in our relations with the US. So we have to be careful not to be drawn into that trap. And I think, the last thing I saw about the divisions and the problems that come from Europe being divided is, I think recently the Portuguese Prime Minister visited Beijing, and perhaps he's now in Japan, or this already passed, but this was a day or two ago. And I saw that the Prime Minister had, according to the Chinese readout, had very good things to say about the Global Governance Initiative. And so that is, on one hand, you get the leader of one member state embracing China, and then you have the leader of the Commission putting de-risking forward. So again, it comes down to this division that we have to manage better. And we should not, I think we have to be careful not to fall into that trap that things are going to be easier with China, because none of the issues are going away. On the contrary, I think they might get even more serious. And last point on that, because Nicholas, you mentioned the private sector, I think, again, none of the de-risking or the political agenda will happen effectively if we do not have the private sector on board. So de-risking will only happen if we have companies moving along and aligning with political objectives to the extent that this is possible, because China will always take advantage of that division. So I'll stop here.
So, Nicholas, 2 quick points. First of all, I think that Taiwan also has still some lessons to learn, some homeworks to do when it comes to its own narrative. And for example, you often hear about the concept of Taiwan's independence. The thing is that we all know what the so-called independence means, right? So the case of abandoning the ROC legacy and establishing like a Republic of Taiwan, let's say. But the problem is that when you speak to people around the world and you say that Taiwan's independence, they think, okay, Taiwan's independence, so that means Taiwan is not independent as of now. That's the logic. So I always find this term independence of Taiwan, or the so-called independence, very confusing to international audience. So it would be really good to change this term, talk about the transition. I'm not saying that Europe should support it or not. This is not our thing to, interfere in Taiwan's domestic affairs and what the Taiwanese people want. But when the discussions about the possible independence happen, I think it would be very good to use a very different term. Otherwise, people get an impression that Taiwan is not independent as of now. And it is, right? It's just a matter of recognition or the lack of global recognition of this independence, rather the very fact of being a sovereign country. So that's one point. And I would also like to further strengthen Zuza's argument that Europe should also learn how to draw its own red lines, because we always talk about China being angry, China being emotional, China's sensitive issues. Yes, but we in Europe also should have the kind of sensitive issues. And our right to choose with whom we trade or with whom we have political relations and whom we meet is also our sensitive issue. So India has been trying to do that a little bit in relations with China, for example, saying that while China is sensitive about its border and the question of Tibet, India is also sensitive about its territoriality, like Arunachal Pradesh, for example, in the northeast. So what they were trying to do was kind of create a balance when it comes to the kind of sensitive narratives, right? So that China is not the one having the kind of narrative leverage or like imposing its own views, right? So I agree, Europe needs to learn how to draw red lines. Not in an aggressive way, it's just about the clarity in a diplomatic way. However, we have to make it clear that these are our limits.
I agree. I mean, of course, being from the Nordics, Russia and Ukraine being, it's a hard red line, of course, which is not necessarily understood, neither in Delhi or in Beijing. Let's be.
If I may.
Yes, very quickly.
Okay. Very quickly. So now we are facing the issues, the so-called trade weaponization from the PRC side. So that could be for European country or like-minded country obstacle to do some improvement or do some better relationship with Taiwan. And how could we use a concrete step to overcome such kind of so-called weaponization? So my personal idea is that if we could, of course, actually EU market, EU countries, EU transatlantic countries, we can do more closer economic trade cooperation, even with some country in Asia, like-minded country, do more in economic way, do more cooperation each other. In regarding to the red line, of course, like-minded countries should also very often to say to PRC side, Yes, you have your red line and we have also our red line. Let me give you example. WHO, everybody understand. Even nowadays, we find a new type of virus we cannot send to WHO. And that is a big loss of the global village. And now we talk about ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization. Taiwan, our flight region, we cover totally 18 international routes and 4 domestic routes. And every year we got 1.64 million flights in Taiwan region. However, we cannot get the so-called information from the ICAO, and we cannot, as observer, attend so-called International Civil Aviation Organization. So that is a loss of the global village. And if we can share such kind of information, and that is also interesting from Europe, how could we improve this kind issues? I think for the European side can do more in this regard. Of course, last but not least, for Taiwan side, we should also do more civil society engagement, that more people to understand each other and what we want. For example, Antonina, you mentioned interdependence. Actually, the most people, majority in Taiwan, our position nowadays is so-called status quo. However, somebody, maybe 1 or 2 or 10 or 15%, they said independent, and somebody will say independent. But in fact, the majority people in Taiwan, status quo. In this regard, do more communication like today's webinar. I think that will be step by step, go forward for both sides, more understanding and more cooperation with each other. Thank you.
We have a few more questions actually, and we're not going to be able to run them, but I would actually recommend to the audience, if you can always try to engage Antonia and Susha directly, because these are the two, I think, absolutely outstanding scholars on Taiwan. And if anybody has the answers, you're looking at them on screen. I'm a student of them, both of them. So, but it's very interesting questions, and I think that what we're looking at here is, of course, we discuss solutions, but I think there's also a moving target. Tension will increase. I think that's very clear. What we've seen is increased pressure from the Chinese side, not least in the military exercises, and the similarity between an actual military action and the exercises it's increasingly hard to distinguish between the two different events. And that is, of course, a strategy from Beijing, no doubt about it. And I think what we need to look at is what Europe can do to maintain stability over the Straits. And as Antonia said, it's not really our side to decide if what political status Taiwan will have. It is really up to the Taiwanese people. But I think that what is important is to ensure that stability is maintained, international contact is maintained, and ensuring a peaceful resolution of this, well, now it's 70 years conflict that we need to ensure. And I think Europe can play an important role, and a much more important role than we had, and not least through these two absolutely amazing scholars that have shed some light to an extremely difficult questions. But with this, I would thank everyone, and please be in contact, and we'll be doing many more events on Taiwan in the coming year. And congratulations to Clement he is unfortunately leaving us here in Stockholm, and he's going to Berlin. So congratulations to Germany. And we will see if the next representative can carry the torch as well as you have done.
Thank you.
So thank you for your time here in Sweden, and thank you to all the audience. So. See you next time.